Check out FlipsideGaming.com for all your gaming needs. Use the promo code HEROES for 10% off any purchase over $10. If you use that promo code between now and January 28th, you will automatically be entered in a drawing to win a Ravnica Allegiance booster box. Check out the description below for details. Hey there, this is John from Heroes and Legends, and welcome to part 2 of our 5-part Ravnica Allegiance full set review. Today we're going to be looking at the Simic guild, and this is a limited review, so if you saw part 1, you know what to expect here. We're going to look at each card and just talk about how they can be best utilized in the draft or sealed formats. Quickly before we get started though, just a fast reminder, if you check out the description below, you'll find a few ways to support the channel, one of which is our Patreon page. You're also going to find products on Amazon down below. If you make any purchases through that initial link, we'll get a small percentage no matter what it is. Finally, Flipside Gaming still offering a promo code for our viewers. Hopefully you can save a little cash while you support the channel. But as always, thank you not only to the folks that use those links, but to all of you. You all made the channel what it is, so thank you, and let's get into it. We're going to begin with the blue cards that do not have watermarks, and then later in the video we'll look at all the Simic watermark cards. But let's begin here with Chillbringer. This is a common 5 casting cost creature that actually has some pretty good abilities attached to it. Now, when you're talking 5 or 6 mana in sealed or draft, you might have better things sometimes. You don't want to get too top heavy, so maybe this doesn't always make your cut. But if you need this thing at 5, it's actually not bad at all. A 3/3 flyer for 5, which is going to tap down a creature not only when it comes into play, but also through its next untap step. That's pretty good. Azorius might appreciate this the most because it is a flying creature and it's also tempoing the opponent a little bit, which is exactly what that deck wants to do, but this could be good in any build where you're playing blue generally. Clear the Mind. This is a good common that could deal with the potential of a mill deck on the other side of the table. Now, you're going to see as we get into these cards today that there definitely is the possibility that somebody could assemble an interesting mill deck. Probably it would be best in Azorius colors. We'll talk more about that once we get to the mill cards. But this is a nice sideboard option to protect yourself against that strategy. And this is pretty backbreaking against that strategy, as a matter of fact. And it cantrips the boot, which is kind of nice. Now, this also could come in handy if your opponent does have some graveyard interactions, although those are not as plentiful in this set compared to Guilds of Ravnica. So I don't know if you're going to come across that all too often. But when you do, pull it out of your sideboard for that circumstance as well. Koral Commander. Yeah, I don't like this card. It's a 3/2 for 3. I don't have a lot to say about it. Not a big fan of 3/2s for 3. They're going to trade down with 2/2s a lot of the time. If you need it for a curve filler, it's there. Sometimes you kind of get backed into a corner and you just need a card. And in sealed especially, you might play it. But if you can avoid it, avoid it. Essence Capture. Nice little crossover counterspell here. Azorius will appreciate this because it can counter target creature for just 2 blue mana. And you know, in sealed or draft, a lot of the gameplay is going to be creature-centric. You can't counter everything with this, obviously, but a lot of the important things you'll be able to hit. And Simic will appreciate this because it gives a +1/+1 counter to up to 1 target creature you control. You don't have to put the +1/+1 counter on a creature you control because that is kind of a nombo with Adapt. But there are some creatures that will do things when they get a +1/+1 counter put on them. We'll see that later in the video, and this will play really well with those. Eyes Everywhere. Okay, I like this uncommon enchantment quite a bit. It costs 3. It's not going to do anything necessarily, at least most of the time, until your next turn. But you know what? From this point forward, you get to scry 1 every turn. That's powerful in draft or sealed. I'm really happy with that alone. Now later on, when you have enough mana, this other ability comes into play where you can exchange this for a permanent your opponent controls. That's kind of interesting. It's a non-land permanent, so it can hit almost anything. So not just creatures, keep that in mind. However, there are a few things you want to be aware of when you use this. First off, you can only use it anytime you could cast a sorcery. Secondly, your opponent gets this card in return, so if they have blue mana, they could activate it later on and take whatever you took back if they want to. Or worse yet, this might open up an opportunity for them to take something of yours that is even better. That could get awkward. Again, only when they can play a sorcery, so remember that. So there is an interesting timing element you have to consider when you play this card when it comes to, can they take the thing back at some point? Does it have summoning sickness when I take it? Is it tapped when I take it? If you're thoughtful about this, you might be able to outplay your opponent even if they do have blue mana as well. Now, if they don't have blue mana, well, great. This is just going to be one-sided and you're going to take what you want at the end, and that's pretty awesome too. Now, the other thing to consider about this card is you're going to want to play it early because that scry ability is really, really good. Once it's on the battlefield, your opponent knows it's on the battlefield. They can play around it to some extent. But you know what? You only spent 3 mana for it. And granted, they might not play their best thing because this is on the battlefield, but that's good for you. They're not playing their best thing. It's slowing them down if nothing else. So you're getting a lot here for 3 mana. This is really, really solid. Fairy Duel List. This is actually an interesting combat trick for blue. Blue doesn't have a lot of ways to deal with creatures directly. This is another kind of indirect way to deal with them. You can surprise your opponent by flashing this into play and then reducing the power of one of their creatures temporarily so that you can get a profitable block. And you know what? In blue, where you don't have a lot of other options like this, it could be fine. It's also a small flyer for just 2 mana. So you put it all together, you're getting a lot here for just the 2 you're paying for it. You might have better 2-drops many times, especially in draft. If you do, this might not always make your cut, but it's very playable, nice little curve filler regardless. Gateway Sneak. Alright, here's one of those Gate Matters cards. We talked about the gate drafting strategy a little bit in the last video, so I don't want to go too deep into that, but if you are on that strategy for whatever reason, this will be a good pickup for you. Now, if you're not all in on the gate plan, this might still be okay. If I have 1 gate, I'm probably not going to play this. If I have 2 gates, I'm going to consider it. 3 gates, yeah, I'm probably going to play it more often than not, just depending on the other 3-drops I have. A 1/3 that's occasionally unblockable with a Curiosity ability built into it, that could be pretty good. Even if I only get to do that one time, I get a 1/3 that replaced itself. That's not bad. If I get to draw 2 cards off this, now it's starting to feel really good. Anything beyond that is just gravy. So I do think I could see myself playing this again, as long as I have enough gates. The other thing you want to think about with this is how it relates to Simic. Simic does have ways to put +1/+1 counters on things. If you made this a little more sizable and occasionally unblockable, that's kind of interesting too. But like I said, I would skip it though, unless I have at least 2 gates, maybe sometimes 3 in my deck. Homunculus, very simple common here. 5-drop, 2/5 with hexproof. And is that going to be good in this environment? I think sometimes it will be. Will there be moments where you have better things, depending on what your build is and what you have when you're looking at your 5-drops or even 6-drops? Yeah, sure. You might not always play this card, but I'll tell you where it's good. Simic's going to enjoy this because you're going to throw +1/+1 counters on it. It's going to become sizable. It doesn't have trample. It doesn't have evasion. But you know what? A big old creature in Drafter Sealed, especially if you can make it large as the game goes on, with hexproof, it's going to be hard to deal with. And it does have that extra toughness too, so joint blocking at some point might not even be an option to take it out. That's not bad. It's going to be better, I think, in the Simic build than anywhere. But maybe if you have an aura to throw on it from white, then it could be good in Azorius as well. It does come up the ground, and Azorius will appreciate that. Mass Manipulation. It's a rare. You're not going to come across this a ton, but it's very powerful if you can swing that casting cost. 4 on color, though, for blue. That's not going to be easy to pull off for a lot of decks in Drafter Sealed, especially Sealed. So, if you can play this card, I would recommend it. It's awesome. However, many times you're not going to be able to. Don't force it if you don't think you can do this consistently. You need to be able to hit those 4 blue in a timely manner, and then you need another 2 mana to actually take something. So, it is kind of nice that it can take a Planeswalker, although that's not always going to be relevant, obviously, in Drafter Sealed. Most of the time, you'll be taking a creature. 6 casting cost, control magic, 4 on color. Yeah, control magic's still a very powerful effect, so it's probably worth it. But you have to be able to get there. If you can't get there, it's a dead card, right? Now, if you have more mana to pour into it, then great, it's even better. This will be best in Simic because green does have some ways to ramp. If you could grab a couple creatures with this, it could be game ending. Overall, though, just know your deck. If you think you can swing it, go for it. If you don't, then leave it out. Mesmerizing Ben Thea. This is a mythic rare bomb, and mythic rares hopefully are bombs most of the time when it comes to Drafter Sealed. I mean, they should be. This one does not disappoint. Kind of nice, too, that even though it's 2 on color, it is monocolor, so it doesn't commit you too hard if you were to pick this up in a draft in pack 1. That's kind of cool. Now, the card is just awesome. Look at it. 4/5 for 5. And you create the 2/0/2 tokens. So that's a lot of power and toughness on the battlefield for 5. Those tokens are illusions, which turn on the hexproof for this. Now you got a 4/5 hexproof as long as those illusions stay alive. Oh, and those illusions have powers too. They gum up the ground for your opponent because basically if they're going to block a creature, they're going to tap it down for an extra turn. that is difficult to deal with. And all the stuff I said a few moments ago about hexproof definitely apply here too. You're going to feel like this card could be even better in a Simic deck if you could make this larger. This would be good in Azorius too. It gums up the ground, and as we saw the other day, there's also a flicker effect and a decent aura in white. Alright, are you ready to talk about some mill? Persistent Petitioners. Okay, so how viable is a mill strategy in Sealed or Draft? In Sealed, I'm going to say pretty unlikely that you're ever going to be able to tap 4 of these things to go for the big 12-card mill here. Who knows, maybe you'll get lucky, but I kind of doubt it. When it comes to advisors, this is a common, but you're not going to find a lot of advisors outside this one. Teysa is an advisor, but she's a rare and she's completely off color. I mean, good to know, but I don't know how often that's going to come into play. In draft, you have more of a chance to pick up copies of these if nobody else is drafting the strategy, but that's hard to know for sure, especially early on in a draft. And later in the draft, people might hate draft some of these as well, so keep that in mind. But if you're lucky, maybe you get 5 or 6 copies of this card. Getting 4 on the battlefield at the same time, though, and keeping them alive might be a little more difficult. Now, if I can't do that, though, for Draft or Sealed, and I only use that first ability, is that good enough? Actually, sometimes it might be. For the most part, we're talking about 40-card decks here. Even milling somebody 1 card a turn, if you get 2 of these out 2 cards a turn, eventually that's kind of backbreaking. They need to consider getting rid of these creatures, which are a little annoying 2-drops, or closing out the game quickly. So it does put pressure on the opponent. There's also other mill cards we'll be looking at in a few moments, so in conjunction with something else, maybe you can pull it off without actually tapping 4 of these. Now, I do think the strategy would be best in Azorius compared to, say, Simic. It could work in Simic, but Simic is a little more creature-centric, where Azorius is going to be more controlling. There you can maybe protect these things, protect yourself a little bit better while you're trying to get to the point where you can make this work, right? So I think generally this is a viable strategy, but it is risky. And we did see that card a moment ago that could really just totally wipe out what you're trying to do if you mill somebody to the point where you almost got them and they play that and shuffle their graveyard back in. There's also the card we looked at the other day, which is a mythic, though, Emergency Powers, that would also kind of reset the clock on this, and that's not going to feel good either. So, yeah, there's a lot of pitfalls here, but I know you're still going to try to do it because it's really cool if you can pull it off, and I do think it's possible. Also, with this and all the mill cards we're going to talk about today, you could mill yourself with this. There's not a lot of reasons to do that in this set, but there's some. Prying Eyes, good common draw spell here. I mean, there's better ones in the set. This one's a little expensive, might not always make your cut for that reason. But if you need something to draw cards, it's a common. Hopefully you can find this one. I like that it's an instant. You're seeing 4 cards. That's quite a few. That's not bad. The drawback being you have to discard 2. Once you're paying 6 mana, though, throwing away a couple lands, I don't think it's going to be that much of a drawback for you typically. Or sometimes you might have some graveyard interactions, which might nullify that as a drawback. And like I said earlier, there's not as many instances of that in this set compared to Guilds of Ravnica, but sometimes it might come into play. Overall, decent card, might not always make your build, but you'll be happy to find it if you need it. Quench, this is kind of like a weak mana leak, but you know what? A weak mana leak is still going to be good a lot of the time in Draft or Sealed. This will be best in Azorius, but I would warn you that later in the game, this is not going to be very good. So I don't want to go crazy with these things. Maybe 1, perhaps 2, depending on what other options I have in my pool, will be okay. I don't know if I want to go deeper than that. Diversify your counter magic a little bit. I mean, this is great early in the game. It's going to be great later in the game, even if your opponent tries to force out a big creature or something. But the problem is they can play around this too. It does have a drawback that you need to consider. Still very playable though. Sage's Row Savant. Okay, this is a good common curve filler. 2-1 for 2, not a 2-2 for 2. You know, I love those, but blue doesn't encounter those all that often. Usually they're doing something like this, 2-1 with an ability or 1-3 with an ability. So kind of is what it is. But yeah, if you need a curve filler and you're in this color, this will do work for you. When it enters the battlefield, scry 2, that makes up the loss of toughness for me. There is a flicker effect in white as well, so maybe this gets a tad bit better in Azorius. I won't call flicker effects out for every enters the battlefield card, but in this case, I think it's worth mentioning because Scry 2 is actually a really good ability. Shimmer of Possibility, it's sorcery speed, but it only costs you 2. It's a common, easy to find, and I think it's actually pretty good. Being able to look at your top 4 cards, taking the best one into your hand, that's not bad for 2 mana. especially if you're trying to smooth out your mana a little bit. Maybe you're going 3 colors, perhaps even 4 colors in your deck. This is a good way to be able to see more cards and hit lands if you need to. Ultimately, this is very playable. I do think it might be better in some decks than others, but what I like about this card is it's good early to help you find land drops. It's good late to help you find heat. Overall, very good for 2 mana. Slimebind. This is a flash 2 casting cost card that's an aura, and it could surprise your opponent in combat. I do like that a lot, giving you a more profitable block. Now, blue doesn't have a lot of ways to deal with creatures directly, like I said earlier. They tend to have more tempo plays, especially in this set, or counter magic. So having one of these in your deck might not be the worst thing in the world, but it might not always make your cut either. It just depends on what your pool looks like. Spanx of Foresight. Alright, this is a no fooling around rare here. Yeah, it's a rare. You won't see it a lot, and again, maybe it should be a bomb in Draft or Sealed, but yeah, this thing is a bomb. It's also monocolor, which is nice too. 2 on color, 2 blue and 2, but this does so much. 4/4 flyer. Those are amazing stats, especially for blue to get that for 4. And then beyond that, you also get to scry at the beginning of your upkeep. Oh, and if this is in your opening hand, you get to scry 3 on your first upkeep? That smooths out your early draws. This thing is insane. If you get a chance to play with it, go for it. It's going to be amazing. You could argue maybe it's better in Azorius. This is going to be good anywhere, though. Swirling Torrents. This is interesting. It costs 6 at sorcery speed, which feels really slow. But it is a big tempo play, being able to return target creature to its owner's hand, so that could be one of your creatures if you maybe have a good enters the battlefield effect or something like that you want to reuse, or it could be an opponent's creature. I think most of the time it will be an opponent's creature, and then you also get to put target creature on top of its owner's library, which is a nice tempo play against an opponent. But it is expensive. I mean, you are paying for this, and you have to decide which 5, 6, 7 drops are going into your deck, right? You can't get too top heavy. Will this make the cut all the time? Probably not, because you might have some big bomb creatures you want to play or something. But especially in Azorius builds, I would highly consider this. Thought Collapse. Alright, another common card that helps with the mill plan. It's a counterspell too for 3 mana. That's actually pretty good. So Azorius will appreciate this because it's just a counterspell for 3 mana. But if you're trying to mill your opponent, then this is going to be part of that strategy, and it could be really good for you. Like I said, I think Mill's going to be better in Azorius colors anyway, so this kind of fits that game plan. Verity Circle, another good enchantment. I'm usually a little hard on these enchantments, but they're pushed in this set. And again, I don't mind spending 3 for this because, if nothing else, that mana sink could be really good later in the game. It doesn't deal with flyers, but it deals with ground creatures. It can protect me or help me get across for damage in a board stall, and I'm drawing cards while I'm doing it. That's pretty awesome. Even if I just tap one thing for 5 and draw a card, great. Later in the game, I might be tapping 2 things at a time, drawing 2 cards, even better. That's possible, especially in a board stall. Now, it also makes your opponent think about tapping their creatures for any abilities, basically, and that's pretty good too. Not to say they won't do it if they need to, but they have to consider that if they do it, you're going to be drawing cards and they could get buried in card advantage and just simply lose that way. This is a real nice rare enchantment. Again, it's rare. You won't see it all the time, but it's good. Wall of Lost Thoughts. Here's another mill card, and it's going to go towards that strategy, but it's also a way to gum up the ground for just 2 mana. Azorius will appreciate that generally. Also, the other day we saw High Alert, which is in Azorius colors, and that is going to combo with defenders and creatures with high toughness. So you could play this in conjunction with that card. And white has that aforementioned flicker card too. There's actually a lot of good reasons to play this outside of milling, but it will be best if you're trying to mill out your opponent with some of those other cards we saw earlier. Windstorm Drake. This thing is really good no matter what strategy I'm in. 3/3 flyer for 5. That might be good enough a lot of times in Draft or Sealed. Other flyers you control get a power boost. Well, even better. Azorius will really love this because they are using a lot of flyers. They're trying to control the board. It will be great there. But no, this is going to be good anywhere you can fit it in. It's also splashable, only 1 blue. I could splash blue into my Orzhov deck and boost my Afterlife tokens with this maybe. So keep that in mind when you're building your deck. This is a great card for Draft or Sealed generally. Alright, let's move on to the watermark cards, beginning with the blue ones. Benthic Biome Answers are first Simic watermark, and this is pretty good. Wizards doesn't always give us great 1-drop creatures in these sets, but this is an exception. It is a rare, so adjust expectations. You won't see it a whole ton, but if you get it, it's going to be good. Looting is very powerful in Draft or Sealed. Whenever you can loot, smooth out your game a little bit, get lands when you need them, toss lands when you don't need them, try to find your heat. It can be overwhelming quickly. Now, this comes in as a 1/1 for 1, which is fragile, but you can quickly adapt it to a 2/2 and loot off that. Then as the game goes on, anytime you can add a +1/+1 counter, and there's plenty of ways to do that in Simic, we'll see that as we go through today, then you get to loot again. This is definitely worth a spot in your Simic deck. Now, maybe if I'm not in Simic, this isn't as good, it might not always make my cut, but in Simic, you're going to love this card. Pteramander, another amazing 1-drop, and this one's an uncommon, so you might find this one around. Now, it's fragile again, 1/1 flyer for 1, but you know what? 1/1 flyers for 1 with an ability traditionally can be pretty good in Draft or Sealed, and this one I think is no exception. It's decent early, but it's great a little bit later in the game, hopefully more in the middle portion of the game. Now, that Adapt 4 costs a blue and 7, but it gets 1 cheaper for every instant and sorcery that's in your graveyard. So in theory, if you can use a few early instants or sorceries, or maybe even mill yourself a little bit, that's an option too with some of the mill cards we saw previously, then this could actually adapt relatively early and be the best thing on the battlefield as a 5/5 flyer. That might not always work out, but I do think it's worth the risk at just 1 mana. This is a nice crossover card too. Simic obviously will care about this with the adapt, but because of the discount with instants and sorceries on that adapt cost, Azorius may be able to actually adapt it quicker than Simic in many cases. Skatewing Spy. Okay, now we're talking here. It's a 2/3 for 4. That doesn't feel great. Blue and 5 adapt 2. That's also a little expensive, but okay. At least it's a card that gets better as the game goes on. It does scale up, so that's cool. That's one thing I do like about adapt generally. But here's the clincher for me. Each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter now has flying, and that does include this one. So it's a little mana intensive, but if I can get there, we're talking a 4/5 flyer. And even if I don't use adapt, all my creatures with +1/+1 counters are going to have flying anyways, so who cares? In the right board state, that could be game over. Remember too, this is splashable. This could be splashed into a Gruul deck, for example. It works well with Riot too. Skitter Eel, good comment here that's just going to show you how adapt works basically. Not always going to make your build. A 4 casting cost 3/3 is kind of on par, but at least it has the Adapt 2 ability for blue and 2. So it does scale up as the game goes on. There's nothing wrong with that. Also, the card gets better with cards that give you bonuses with +1/+1 counters or interact well with +1/+1 counters. For example, the card we just saw a moment ago. There are ways to make this feel better than it actually is in a lot of Simic decks. And if you have those type of tools, yeah, you might play this more often than not, but it might not always make your cut. Okay, let's move on to the green watermark cards. Growth Chamber Guardian. Okay, it's a rare. 99% of the time in Draft or Sealed, you're not going to have a second copy of this. Is it worth playing on its own, though? Yes, it is very worth playing on its own. I say this all the time. I'm only going to say it once in this video. You heard it once in the last video. The 2 spot in your curve for Draft or Sealed is the most critical. You need these 2/2s for 2 whenever you can find them. 2/2s for 2 with upside, even better. This is a great upside. You can play this on turn 2. It's a 2/2, nice curve filler. It keeps your legs under you at the beginning of the game. Later in the game, when it becomes maybe obsolete, you can grow it to a 4/4. It doesn't have trample, it doesn't have evasion, at least as is. But it still scales with the game, and I'm okay with that. If I draw this late, it doesn't feel like a horrible draw. I can spend 2 green and 3, basically, to get a 4/4. Definitely better than just a 2/2 for 2 on turn 13 or 14 of a game, right? Great card. When you can play it, go for it. Incubation Druid. Okay, another really good rare. One thing I want to point out just from a rules perspective, this doesn't fix color. It can only produce mana that is the same as a land you control can produce. So keep that in mind. Okay, now let's talk about this card, but ignore the fact that if it has a +1/+1 counter, it can give you 3 mana instead of 1. Even without that ability, this is still an awesome card. It's a 2-drop 0/2. It's a mana dork. It doesn't fix, like I said, but it does let you skip the curve a little bit. That's going to be great in Draft or Sealed. And with the Adapt 3, it's going to scale a little bit and also interact with anything that interacts with +1/+1 counters. There is a ton of efficiency behind this card for 2 mana. Now, let's add in the fact that if it does get a +1/+1 counter, whether that's Adapt or hopefully through another cheaper means earlier in the game, now I can pull 3 mana at a time instead of 1. Okay, that's just insane. Now, in Draft or Sealed, maybe you don't even have good things to ramp into sometimes, but that's why I like the fact that if I can get a counter on this early, and there's a lot of ways to do it, we're going to see some in a few minutes here, then I could just ramp into something mid-rangey, and that is good enough. That's really skipping your curve, right? And that's how you win games a lot of times, by just skipping ahead of curve and staying ahead on resources. This card helps you do that. Play it whenever you can. If you happen to have something to ramp into, or an X-Spell, or a Mana Sink, well, this gets even better. Storeform Hybrid, another bear with upside. You know I'm on board. It's a common too, you might be able to find it. And 2 green and 4 to adapt 4. It's a little pricey, makes it a 6/6. And it doesn't have trample, it doesn't have evasion. But again, you need these 2-drop cards. I won't hit you with the whole spiel again, but you want them in your deck. So this one is going to be great. It's good early, it's good late, plenty of efficiency. Steeple Creeper, I'm going to skip this one a lot of the time. Not all the time though. I mean, there are some builds where this might be okay. It does cost blue to activate, so let's say we're going to throw it in a Simic build. Many times you might have better 3-drops. A 4/2 is going to trade down with a 2/2 for 2, for example, or a 2/1 for 2. And that's not going to feel all that good some of the time. Now, when you can activate the ability of 4/2 in the air, actually isn't that bad, but 4 mana to do that is a little intensive, and that would be good early in the game, but it's going to choke you off from your plays, which isn't great. Later in the game, the 4/2 in the air isn't quite as impressive, so by the time you can consistently pay the mana and still continue with your board presence, it just isn't as good anymore. Here's where I would consider playing it though. If I have a lot of ways to get +1/+1 counters on my stuff, and I think consistently I could do that with this card, well then it does become a lot better. Trollbred Guardian, this is a 5/5 for 5, so those are pretty nice stats generally. This is also an uncommon, which is nice. It can adapt 2 for just a green and 2, but here's what really pushes it for me. Each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it has trample, so if I do use the adapt, now this is a 7/7 trample creature. And beyond that, all my creatures with +1/+1 counters now have trample. This will be great in Simic, obviously. There's adapt, there's a lot of ways to get +1/+1 counters on stuff. This will be great with Gruul because of Riot, another way to get a +1/+1 counter on your things. And they could have some big creatures potentially, more so than even Simic at times. So yeah, this is very good. I think whenever I have an opportunity to play this, I'm going to do it. This, as well as Skatewing Spy, are nice uncommon win conditions for some builds, even if you never activate their adapt. Alright, let's move on to the gold cards with Aeromunculus. This is a real solid common, and you might look at this and say, yeah, seems good, 2/3 for 3, flying. But that is very competitively costed just generally. I mean, a 2/3 flyer for 3, even if it is 2 different colors, you don't see that all that often. And then it also has the Adapt 1 ability here for 4 more mana. Very good card. A 2/3 is going to be solid in the early game. A 3/4 flyer is going to be solid in the mid game. Applied Biomancy. Nice little combat trick here in these colors. You don't see that all the time either. But green and blue giving something +1/+1 till end of turn. And or return target creature to its owner's hand. That's kind of nice. Again, very cost effective. And it is versatile too. It can be a regular combat trick where you just pump something. You can bounce an opponent's creature if you want to get more offensive on your turn and attack in. You could bounce one of your own creatures to protect it from a removal spell. Or maybe you have a good entrance to battlefield effect you'd like to replay. For 2 mana, there's a lot of economy here. Depending on your deck, maybe it doesn't always make your cut, but I think it's relatively solid. At least it's a cheap instant that does something that surprises your opponent here. Biome Answers Familiar. It's a 2/2 for 2. 2 different colors this time, but that's still okay. And yes, any activated ability on a creature you control is 2 less to activate. It is going to be great with many creature activated abilities, but especially adapt. It is a dual color card, but if I open this in pack 1 of a draft, I'd be hard pressed not to just take this and try to force adapt. I think it could be amazing. And then there's another ability we haven't even talked about, basically turning off the drawback that you can't adapt if the creature has +1/+1 counters on it. So you could double adapt or triple adapt, or if you have a counter on something from another ability, then you can still adapt. Awesome rare, definitely, if you get the chance to play with it. Combine Guildmage. Now, this is not one of my favorite Guildmages, but it's not bad in these colors. The first ability is kind of a nombo with adapt, which feels awkward sometimes, but not all your creatures will be adapt creatures, so it's just fine. The second ability lets you move a counter. Now, if you're trying to move counters off a creature so you can adapt again, and this taps to do that, that's going to be pretty slow. Unless it happens to be an adapt 1 or something, and then still it feels like a slow way to get there. But think about the Incubator Druid. There's a lot of really good combos that this does enable. If I have some of those combos, I'm going to be very interested in playing this card. Also, that second ability can make combat tricky for your opponent, which is nice. Frilled Mystic. The only downside to this is, yes, it is a little color intensive, being 2 green and 2 blue, but this is a great card. 3/2 flash, counters a spell when it enters the battlefield. Kind of like Mystic Snake, right? And it's going to be really solid for you in draft or sealed. Again, as long as you feel your deck can cast it consistently, it's not very splashable, but it's still very strong. Galloping Laser Hog. Okay, this thing is awesome because it really is a payoff for these adapt and all these +1/+1 generating spells that you might have. 3/3 with trample for 5, but when it enters the battlefield, you can remove any number of counters off your creatures. This will then get double that amount of +1/+1 counters, so this could be a really, really big trample creature, potentially. Also, taking counters off of a creature allows it to readapt, so you're getting great economy here. Basically, you're getting a huge power toughness boost on the battlefield by moving those counters over and doubling them and then being able to adapt again. Really solid payoff card if you're in this strategy for sure. Growth Spiral. This is a good card. It's not always going to work the way you want it to work though, so keep that in mind. You need to play this early, and being 2 different colors might prohibit that sometimes. If you get this card later in the game or even in the middle portion of the game, it's not going to feel really good. It's great when you can jump the curve a little bit. Turn 1, you play a land. Turn 2, you play a land in this, and now an additional land. That will be awesome. Also, cantrips. Nothing wrong with that. And the cantrip does take the sting away at least a little bit if you draw this later, but you're still paying 2 mana, 2 cantrips, so remember that. To replace itself, it's not free. Another thing to consider is this gets slowed down by guild gates, and you might not be able to consistently play this on turn 2 many times, unfortunately. At the end of the day, I do see myself most of the time playing this card because I do think it's worth the risk, but I could also see myself skipping it sometimes too, depending on what else I have in my pool. Gyre Engineer, another good mana dork here, 3 casting costs this time, so a little more expensive, but it does tap for 2 mana, and it taps for a blue and a green, that's cool. Little fragile being a 1/1, but you know what, I don't care. If this survives, it's going to again help me skip the curve, definitely worth it. Hydrate Crais, here's another just crazy mythic. If you get it, just play it. I mean, it's going to be phenomenal for you. It's in Simic colors. It's going to really appreciate green, especially because of the ramp potential there. And if you can just pour a few counters onto this thing, it's going to be solid for you. Flying trample creature. The X will give it its power and toughness in the form of +1/+1 counters. Again, it could interact with some of these other cards that care about +1/+1 counters a little bit. And then aside from that, you might draw some cards and gain a little life too. This card is doing a ton, and obviously the more mana the better, but even if you played this with a reasonable amount of mana, it's good. Imagine playing this with 6 mana, for example. You're going to gain 2 life, draw 2 cards, and have a 4/4 flying trample creature? Yeah, this thing is insane. You're not going to see it a lot, but if you get to play with it, go for it. This is an interesting mythic, Prime Speaker Vanaf R. Maybe it's not a big bomb all the time like the last one, but this could be real good for you too. A 2/4 for 4, those are decent stats. I like the toughness here. It is stable, and it has a birthing pod ability built into it. Now, the downside to this type of ability in Limited is that sometimes you'll have breaks in those chains sooner than later. Even if you had a nice curve when you built your deck, it is a 40-card deck, and as time goes on, you might quickly run out of your 4 or 5 drops within your deck, and if that's the case, you might have breaks in this chain. However, look at it this way. If I play a 5-drop and I can move up to a 6-drop, which might be a big bomb rare or something, all of a sudden this gets kind of interesting, right? Yeah, I do think most decks will appreciate it. Some might appreciate it more than others, especially if you have some good enters of battlefield effects tied into your creatures. Charcot Crab. Here's another crazy uncommon. 4/4 for 4. Nice stats. The adapt is 4 for an adapt 1. That's okay, making it a 5/5. But look at this ability. Whenever this thing gets 1 or more +1/+1 counters, it can tap down target creature an opponent controls. That creature doesn't untap during the next untap step. Combo this with the Guild Mage we saw a few moments ago. Or hopefully you just have a lot of ways to put +1/+1 counters on stuff as you get going. And you could really just tie up your opponent's board state and perhaps win the game, get past a board stall. This thing is going to be awesome for you when you get to play with it. Also, it is splashable. It is 2 different colors, but even if I was in Azorius, for example, I might splash the green, because Azorius would really appreciate that ability as well. Actually, probably a lot of decks would appreciate the ability. You just want to have a few ways to get counters on the thing. Simic Ascendancy. Well, here's a great way to get counters on that thing. This is an awesome 2 casting cost enchantment, which is going to act as a mana sink to just build out your board as the game goes on. Let's pretend I don't even care about abilities with +1/+1 counters or anything like that. I could just be in a board stall. I'm on turn like 10, 11, 12. I'm trying to pull ahead. I keep drawing land. Great. I'm just going to go ahead and make what I have bigger. Eventually, I'm going to win that way. Now, aside from that, there's also another way to win the game attached to this card that's going to tie into adding the +1/+1 counters. So you got that alternate win condition. And I do think it's possible in a board stall and limited to get there actually with the other win condition. So you just kind of slowly paint your opponent in the corner. Either they're going to lose the power and toughness on the battlefield, or they're going to lose to the alternate win condition. This thing's awesome. It's a rare, so again, you won't see a lot of it, but it's awesome. Zagana Utopian Speaker, well, I don't know, welcome to the bomb rare section of the video, I guess. 4/4 for 4. Each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it has trampled. And on top of that, if you have something with a +1/+1 counter in play when this enters the battlefield, you get to draw a card so it replaces itself a lot of the time in these colors. And then, for 6 mana, this can adapt 4, making it an 8/8 trample creature. Yeah, this is also just insane. And again, I would consider splashing this. Maybe in a Gruul deck, I would splash blue for this. It's real solid. Scuttlegator. This is okay. It's not amazing. It's very expensive for what it is, and the adapt is very expensive. But it does interact well with some of the cards we've been looking at, so there are times you might play it. Consider the hybrid mana too, making it more flexible. That's kind of nice. So maybe I play this in an Azorius build because there is that combo with High Alert that I might get there. So this is a defender, and it can be a rather large defender too. Maybe I'm in a Simic build and I care about counters and I have a little ramp behind it. So I could play this as a 6/6 defender and eventually make it a 9/9. That's pretty sizable. Even without trample or evasion, a 9/9 is a presence in limited. Because remember, it can attack if it has a +1/+1 counter. Or if I can get a counter onto it with another card like the Guild Mage or something, now I have a 7/7 that can attack maybe earlier than scheduled. Yeah, it might not be for every build, but there are times that it will make sense in your deck. Incubation and Incongruity. Okay, we haven't seen a lot of amazing removal spells today, although there are some other ones in green that we'll be looking at another day. But this is a good one. Exile target creature. Now, the creature's controller will get a 3/3. Of course, this is the Incongruity side. But if they have a big flyer or something, you won't care if they have a 3/3. Or in a pinch, if your back's against the wall, you could always just go ahead and take one of your small creatures, turn it into a 3/3. Hopefully you don't need to do that, though, but it's an option. And it is an instant, which means if my creature was going to die anyway, I might find some value, or I might be able to surprise my opponent with this generally. The incubation side is not bad either. It's hybrid mana, which makes it a little looser when it comes to the requirement. And aside from that, it's going to help you dig for a creature, which is exactly what you want to do in limited most of the time. Simic will appreciate that, and Gruul will appreciate that. Here's the rare split card, Repudiate and Replicate. I like the hybrid mana on Repudiate. It actually would feel best maybe in an Azorius build where you're trying to be controlling. It's a nice stifle effect. It's pretty cheap, and it's going to turn off an activated ability or triggered ability, which does include things like Adapt, Afterlife, Riot, so that's kind of cool. Replicate is just going to be good in sealed or draft generally, where you know you're going to have a lot of creatures. Copying your best creature for 3? There's definitely nothing wrong with that. That brings us to the one artifact Simic Locket, and I talked about the lockets in detail in part 1, so I won't go into all that again today, but I will say this. Lockets that create green are a little more interesting because green does care about bigger mana typically. Now the last 2 cards we're about to look at are the only 2 reprints in this video, oddly enough. On to the lands, and same thing with the shock lands. Again, I won't repeat what I said in part 1, but here's Breeding Pool. And finally, the Simic Guild Gates, and these are great color fixers. Again, I go into more detail, of course, in the first chapter. Alright, with that being said, that is the Simic Guild. Tomorrow we'll do part 3 of the set review. We're going to look at the Orzhov Guild. But until next time, hey, thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe, and have a great day. Hey, thanks for watching. This video is made possible through the generous support of viewers like you on Patreon. Check out the description below for links to our Patreon page as well as our Amazon affiliate store, where a small percentage of all sales will also help support the channel. Finally, if you haven't had a chance yet to subscribe, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the new videos on Heroes and Legends. Talk to you again soon, and have a great day.